Hey guys, Loman02. This is going to be some 100 card Singleton content. If this is your first time watching my 100 card Singleton content, the best way to explain 100 card Singleton, some people would say commander without the commander. I would say a more apt way to explain this format is constructed cube. So cube is something I very much enjoy, and I really love 100 card Singleton. I'm not sure which more, but 100 card is interesting from the standpoint that I think in a lot of ways, for me at least, cube helps inform it, because a lot of times you're not really forced to evaluate cards in a vacuum or over time in synergy with others and how they play out. So based on a recent cubing experience, I came back to my Red Deck Wins variant, which is, as you can see, a 100 card Singleton version of a Red Deck Wins deck, which is similar in a lot of ways to cube, with the exception that it's just 60 more cards and it has a 15 card sideboard. And I changed two pretty key things in the deck. I added a Goblin Chain Whirler into the deck, and also added a sideboard Direfleet Daredevil. The Goblin Chain Whirler surprised me in two aspects. One, it does give the deck some extended range against white weenie style builds. Like white attack decks tend to be very difficult for red decks to beat. Because here our sideboard has such hits as Slagstorm, Anarchy, Pyrokinesis, Sudden Demise, Havoc, just to win that matchup with Curse Scroll, because it's a very difficult matchup to win. The Chain Whirler is a good main deck way to also help support against that matchup. And the other synergy that kind of put me over the top on Goblin Chain Whirler is that it deals very well with Mana Dorks and 1 toughness creatures. So in the mirror, it's a very strong card against other red decks, because red creatures tend to have much higher power than they do toughness. And then against like the green ramp decks, it tends to buy you a turn and possibly get you a 2-for-1. Red Deck Wins is not really known for its card advantage, and Goblin Chain Whirler, I think in a lot of ways, in certain matchups, does tend to be card advantage. He also just domes for 1 the turn he comes into play, and I think First Strike is highly relevant as well, because it allows him to beat through a lot of the bigger green creatures, and also blow up the little ones. So pretty strong card, I think. It's obviously shown its value in Standard. And I don't watch the Pro Tour. I didn't watch this Pro Tour. I know Black-Red, was pretty much the craze, and then just a Red Deck Wins won the tournament. I think off of top decks, if I recall the stories correctly. Direfleet Daredevil, same story. So I think Direfleet Daredevil is good for other reasons. Like, one, has First Strike, which I actually do. I think First Strike is a very relevant card. Very relevant evergreen ability for winning mirror matches. I think Flying and First Strike tend to do that, like Evasion or just the ability to win in combat. Do that, especially if you're playing with fairly equal creatures, like equal in size. And White tends to have a ton of First Strikers and a ton of Flyers. Just better creatures in general. And Direfleet Daredevil is not a bad creature in and of himself. For 2 mana, you're getting a bear that will generally win against other bears in combat, and you're getting a free spell off of it. It is obviously conditional, but against the white decks, you're going to get something like Swords to Plowshares, maybe a Council's Judgment. When I played this card in Cube, I got a Harmonize off of it, which was pretty stellar. I think I also got an Anguished Unmaking off of it, which is also pretty stellar. Anguished Unmaking killing Gristlebrand, which is pretty stellar, because the card gives you abilities to deal with stuff that you typically wouldn't be able to deal with. And it's pretty flexible. I do like it against control as well. You can, recast some card draw. You can recast a Cryptic Command and tap all their dudes and then get in there for a big attack. Like, I've done a lot of pretty sweet things with Direfleet Daredevil, and I think, it's a flexible enough card that it deserved a board slot just for testing. And I think eventually I'll find a way to make it or put it in the main. I just haven't found where I want it yet. So, we did go ahead and test this against a fellow player, Michelle Wong. And actually, come to find out for us, she loves playing against Red Deck Wins, because most of her decks are built to hate it out. So I chose this deck kind of knowing that and figuring it would be a tougher matchup for me. My opener's pretty strong, though, so I have 1, 2, 3 creature drops. Eidolon is probably one of the best 2-drops in the deck. There's not many things I can think Eidolon on curve is bad against, especially for this style of deck. Ball Lightning is probably not the best 3-mana creature, but it does the most damage for the least amount of mana. It does the most burst damage, I guess you could say. And we also have a Burst Lightning, no pun intended, to deal with any Mana Dork if she's playing like a base green deck. So I very much so like this, although it's going to be tough to find a time to cast the Burst Lightning. So we go ahead and say, yep, we're going to play this. We do get the die roll, which is always big in these style of matchups, especially when you have a curve out like this. Go ahead and get the Rakdos Cackler down. She fetches a Forest, playing around Price of Progress, which I think is wise here. We go ahead and get an attack in, and then get the Eidolon down, which is going to mean that anything she casts for probably the next couple of turns is going to be done at a deficit of a shock. She just cast a very powerful card against us, but we have drawn well over the last 2 turns and found an Arc Trail. We do have to 2-for-1 ourselves there, but I guess we don't. Technically, it's a 2-for-1 on one card, but I'm getting another card with it, so it's 2-for-2. I do get the Noble there, which puts her back on mana and gives me exactly enough for a turn 4 kill with Ball Lightning. So Red Deck Wins sometimes just does what it does, and this is obviously a very fast, very powerful draw. We've also had some odd investment cards, like the Bomat Courier I think I've talked about before, and I do think it's a 1-drop worthy of this deck, because as you can see, it's turn 4 and I have 2 cards left in my hand, and by turn 5, if there needed to be a turn 5, I would probably just cast the Chain Lightning main 1, Bomat Courier main 1, attack. If they chose to block it, pop it, and just draw the extra card. It's essentially acted as a taunting elf at that point, or a master decoy, or whatever you want to call it. And I've also got to draw a card. It's cycled itself for mana, which is still not bad. But if you get this thing down turn 1, it does not do the most damage, so it's not going to lead to the fastest draws. But it's pretty assured, because if you get this thing up to like 3 or 4 cards, and you expend the rest of your cards and just ditch whatever lands or whatever cards you can't or don't want to cast in your hand, Bomat Courier tends to transmute into some pretty potent cards that punch up a lot more than the 1/1 body that he is on. So that was game 1. So Michelle has pretty notorious sideboards against Red Deck Wins. But I opened this hand here, and this hand is not great, but this hand can deal with a Kitchen Finks with the Rite of Flame, or Pillar of Flame rather, and it has a turn 1 Stormkirk Noble, or Stromkirk Noble. So what my thinking is like if she plays a Mana Dork, I can cast the Stromkirk and then burn it off on the following turn. And then I also have this Zergo Bellstriker to either haste in there if I'm afraid she's going to have like Wrath effects, or just cast him out to get a 2/2 on the board. And Ironclaw Orcs. So she leads off with a Croson Verge, which is a good investment card. I draw very well and find an Earthshaker Kenra. Earthshaker Kenra is actually going to give me a better line. Because she played nothing on turn 1, I don't have to make the hard choice of Pillar of Flaming her 1-drop birds or playing out the Noble Hierarch, so I just play out the Hierarch here. And my plan is now, it's likely she doesn't have a 1-drop creature, so maybe she has like a Lotus Cobra or something, and the Earthshaker Kendra is going to allow me to attack past it and get my Stromkirk Noble to a 2/2. And then from there, I don't really have a 3-mana play, so I can probably Pillar of Flame the next thing she plays after her 2-drop. To get in there with the Stromkirk Noble to get to a 3/3. So really the name of this game is how do I best enable my Stromkirk Noble to get huge? At least at this point, that's kind of what I'm thinking. So my opponent does play out a Deathrite Shaman, which is a life gainer and is pretty good. I draw well here into Pyrokinesis, and my thinking is like the Zergo Bellstriker has probably just become my patsy to be Pyrokinesis fodder. My opponent does play out a Sylvan Caryatid, or I'm sorry, a Carven Caryatid. So this card gets cast, and once Moto unfreezes, she'll draw a card off of it. It's 2/5, draws you a card, defends. It's just very big. And that will showstop the Stromkirk Noble. I do go ahead and 2-for-1 myself here, because I don't think there's a good way to deal with that 2/5, and I'd rather have my creature threats in play than my burn, I think. Because she's able to gain life with the Deathrite Shaman. It's good just to have a habitual threat on her, I think, at this point. This is a pretty obvious Restoration Angel, which I kind of felt like in my bones. When she didn't do anything that turn, I was pretty sure she was on Resto. So I'm glad I have this Pyrokinesis, and I'm able to deal with the Resto on the spot. She's able to block there with the Deathrite Shaman and plays a Circle of Protection red. We're able to get in for 2 damage here, putting her down to 5. So this is kind of an interesting point in the game. So my opponent has gotten down like a complete hoser card, Circle of Protection. However, the one downside to Circle of Protection is it decentivizes you casting spells. So if I am able to present permanent threats to her, then she's going to be less and less incentivized to actually cast spells with using her mana, so she can just stop my spells, which eventually I think is a losing game unless you just draw lands for the rest of the game. Because eventually you just come to discards because you won't hit enough lands, and you'd be discarding spells and just not really winning the game, but not really losing the game, which eventually Red Deck Wins will find a way. So I do go ahead and cast out the Goblin, and I know this is not going to kill her, but I just want her to tap her mana. I do blow up her Noble Hierarch. I could have gotten 2 damage to her face there to put her down to 3, but I think it was better to actually kill her mana, because killing the mana essentially means 1 less Circle of Protection activation, which means any land drop that she makes from this point forward is more and more likely to be committed to keeping the Circle of Protection active. She does draw land here, and debates on playing a spell, but you'll see she just passes it back. It may seem annoying to you for me to continue to attack, which I do in this game. And the reason I do is, one, I don't want her to pop the Croson Verge. I don't want her to find the time to pop the Croson Verge. And I don't want her to cast spells on her turn or my turn. So like, we know she has Resto Angel. There's other haste creatures that could be viable here, like Avacyn could be done. She goes ahead and stops all my creatures. I did cast out the Unearth creature just to tie up her mana. It's not really going to get better. It's actually better in my graveyard than my hand, I think. I do find a Monastery Swiftspear off of an Abbot of Carroll Keep here. Getting an attack with 4 of them to tap down 4 of her mana. My plan is here, I'm probably going to try to burn her on her end step or upkeep to get her to tap mana. And then I'm also going to get an attack in with the Grim Lavamancer. So my expectation is I'm going to get in probably 3 damage next turn and get her down to 2. So basically right now, her 6 mana pair up with my 6 creatures. But I have an Unearth spell in the graveyard, and I'm forcing her to tap a mana to prevent 2 from Grim Lavamancer here. Which means I'm going to get in for 2 damage and get her down to 2. She fetched for 1. So basically, the Grim Lavamancer and the Goblin should get in here, and everything else should be stopped. But she will be at a lowly 2 life. She cast the 3 visits, which is good on the turn after she cast it. I go ahead for an attack here. I'm going to get 1 damage in because of her casting the 3 visits. And she will be at the dubious and unenviable position of being at 1 life against Red Deck wins. Although she does have a Cop Bar in play. So one of the other things I've done with this deck is I've actually upped the critter count, because a lot of folks will use Warmth and Circle Protection Red to beat Red Deck wins. And in actuality, I think you can build Red Deck wins in a way to beat both those cards. Warmth is pretty good versus Red Deck wins, but it's not as good against permanent-based threats, because it's a one-time effect. So it's like really good against, like, if you're just trying to like lightning bolt your opponent out, you're probably going to have a very difficult time doing it through a Warmth. But if you're attacking, then it's really good. I tap my mana here. I have no intentions of casting this, but I tap my mana there just to let her know I have a card. Well, to try to get her to believe I have a card. So it makes her worried about instant speed effects when I just decide not to do it. But in actuality, I didn't want to cast it regardless. I want to wait for another threat, a haste threat, or a burn spell to finish the game out. She goes ahead and discards here. So she's finally discarding at this point because she's not made land drops. And she's not casting creatures because she can't, because she'll die if she doesn't have the Cop R up. I cast the Keldon Marauders out, and it's going to do 1 damage to her, so she has to prevent it because she is at 1 life. And she goes ahead and prevents damage from the rest of my team. And I am able to cast the Land through Hellion, which would be the lethal, the remaining lethal 1 damage to end the game. So she waits on the last one, but I just throw this thing down and say, alright, good game. Because she can either stop the Land through Hellion or the Grim Lavamancer, but either one is lethal. All it's going to take here is 1. So, Cop Bar, not always the savior you want. Like, it's best in, I think, big mana decks. I don't as much like it in Naya. I think Naya can tend to just beat down on Red Deck wins. Now, obviously, when you get to a very low life total, it becomes a little better. But I think Naya can tend to just win if it casts big, silly creatures like Obstinate Baloth, Inferno Titan, whatever, to beat down on Red Deck wins. But as you can see, she went with the Circle Protection Red plan, and Circle Protection Red is kind of interesting to me because, if you have a high permanent count Red Deck wins deck, you still kind of win as assuredly as you would, because this hand would have won many, many turns ago. We're on turn 14, and we're still eking it out, but this hand would have won many, many turns ago. Circle Protection Red just ensures it's lengthened out, but because your opponent's using it, or they have to use it in order to stay alive, they're not really doing anything. So it's kind of like a one-sided stasis, and eventually the red deck wins will draw out of it because the opponent's lands are always going to be tapped, they're not going to be casting their spells, and you will be, so eventually you'll overpower it, or find a time and place where you can overpower it. So I think this was a very interesting set of games. I wanted to kind of, revisit Red Deck Wins and share some of the joys of 100-card Singleton as a format, and also kind of revisit, some of my philosophies and thoughts on Circle Protection Red and how you can build Red Deck Wins to beat it, and how you can kind of like think and play the philosophy of play around Circle Protection Red. Because I do not think it's like the messiah of the matchup against Red. I think there's a lot of ways to beat it, and it's more about patience. Like some folks may concede when they see a Circle Protection Red, you probably shouldn't, because and you should always attack. Like, just force them to tie up their mana, because if they haven't developed their board in a meaningful way up to that point, you're going to win because their mana is just going to get destroyed. Basically, they're casting a one-sided Armageddon every turn on themselves to stop me, which is great, because that's another aspect of Red Deck Wins, is like you want to get underneath their mana development. And Circle Protection Red, well, it does stop you from losing if you're playing it. It is basically the antithesis of mana development, because your mana is just sunk into it. I mean, that thing could say like cumulative upkeep 1 on it is basically what it says right now, and that wouldn't be an inaccurate statement. Anyways, guys, this is 100 Card. This is Red Deck Wins. Very, very cool format. If you enjoy Cube and you've been watching some of my Cube videos, I highly recommend that you give this format a shot sometime. There is a Discord on it. I should probably link it. But the format is essentially Cube. It's unpowered with the exception of Time Twister. Time Twister is in the format, but the broken mana is not. So you don't get broken mana like you do in Vintage Cube, but you do get pretty much everything else. There's a few outliers, like Channel's not in there, Balance is not in there, although Balance possibly could be. Mind Twist is not. Mind Twist is... One, like Mind Twist is not even a great card in certain matchups. Like against this deck, it's probably not that good. And two, it's it's not a card that leads to generally great interactive games, and it doesn't really increase the viability of any one given archetype. And then Skull Clamp's not in there. But other than those cards, I'm pretty sure everything that's in the cube is in 100 card. So very, very cool format. Basically constructed cube, and cool set of games. I appreciate Michelle giving me the game here. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and cut it. Put this one up for an updated, I suppose, Red Deck Wins deck. More of a templating check on the sideboard, and then like the one main deck change. And then some of the gameplay, because I do think this game right here was very specifically informative about how to beat Circle of Protection Red. And some of the faults of that card as well. I'm not saying the card's bad. Like, I do think Copar is good, but it's kind of specific to certain situations, and it's not as good in a situation where you're essentially behind on the board. All right, guys, going to cut it there. Take care now and enjoy.